Perfect. So let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Yvonne Schwab, ACG Silicon Valley CEO. And I mentioned this earlier, I can't believe it's December 1st of 2020, nonetheless. What a year. Well, I'm excited to have this event today on how to promote efficiencies and avoid cross-border M&A integration pitfalls in collaboration with the ACG San Francisco chapter. Both of our chapters offer an array of networking opportunities. With almost 15,000 members in 59 chapters across the world, ACG provides local connections with a global reach. ACG Silicon Valley is offering a variety of virtual events in the coming months. We invite you to visit our website at acgsv.org to see the full calendar, including our Female Executive Leaders Circle this Thursday, our Public Board Circle on Monday, and our Holiday Happy Hour. We already have some great events planned for next year, including obviously the economic outlook, the capital outlook, an event on e-commerce, and many more. Now, we are excited to offer you today's event, which would not have been possible without our sponsors Vistra and Velocity Global. Thank you very much. I would now like to introduce you to our moderator today, Mark Fielding, who works on Velocity Global's strategic partnerships team, focusing on cross-border M&A. His role involves liaising with financial sponsors, legal teams, and other advisors involved in cross-border transactions to develop and implement HR operational efficiency strategies using international PEO. Now, without further ado, I'll give you Mark.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Yvonne. Very much appreciated. Before I go into kind of a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today, I'd like to introduce my co-panelists, Mike Geldart, who works at Exelair Partners, which is a private equity firm that invests in all sorts of business, including in businesses that have an international footprint. And Mike and I have worked together on a project this year that involved such satellite employee populations. So we'll hope to hear some of best practice and tips and tricks on how to operationalize those types of cross-border assets from him. And joining us as well is Saul Harriton, who works at Vistra, and he helps private equity and strategic companies with their setup post M&A. So from everything from how to set up the corporate infrastructure to how to manage various functions of that corporate infrastructure internationally, from HR to annual tax filing, etc. So in terms of structure, we thought we would make this a little conversational, a bit of a round table, open fire chat, and we'd structure our conversation around three central themes. One is pre-deal diligence, so what you can do to mitigate risk and avoid pitfalls before you pull the trigger on an investment. Integration and execution of an ROI strategy. And then finally, future-proofing your asset, so being able to maintain that flexibility and being nimble with what the world can throw at you. Given that it is now the 1st of December, and that we are safely the other side of Thanksgiving, we thought that we would put a little bit of a festive theme to our presentation, and I'll be kicking off each theme with an anecdote, starting with the ghost of Christmas past, HR operational diligence, and how to make sure that you can avoid pitfalls that might be lurking in any future assets that you are looking to invest in. So this anecdote is something that I experienced with a client ourselves. So in this situation, a PE fund basically bought an asset that involved a peripheral employee population in the UK. That employee population was supplemented by a number of independent contractors. Now, the PE fund in question did have visibility on the contractor use, but didn't decide to dig into it too much prior to making the investment because, among other things, it was a peripheral employee population. The crux of the asset was based onshore in the US. But once they acquired the asset, they found out that there was actually quite a lot of liability associated with those independent contractors due to, among other things, the pending IR35 regulation in the UK, which put the bonus of proof of making sure that contractors are compliant on the user of the contractors rather than on the contractors. And that increased the potential liability both in back taxes and punitive measures for the PE funding question. A quick back of the envelope calculation shows that for 10 contractors over 5 years paid at 100K at 15.3% burden, that amounted to about 765K plus obviously punitive damages. And on top of that, they also identified that some of the public sector clients of that company, of their future investment company, were now requiring proof of contributions to pay PAYE, so that's the social systems of the UK, to continue the relationship with the investment company. So there was the added potential there for the loss of clients, which obviously would have affected the ROI on that investment quite significantly as well. Obviously, this could have been mitigated or at least planned for if the PE fund in this particular instance had dug into the use of those independent contractors and their status as independent contractors. So that's to give you an idea that there are areas where essentially a little more diligence could have been helpful, but hopefully that will help us kick off the discussions. And maybe we can start with a question to you, Mike. When you are considering investing in an asset, what are the key points of diligence that you undertake? What do you think are some of the most important points of diligence, also considering the HR and operational aspects of a potential future asset?
Mark, thank you. So I thought we start with the concept of kind of the why, and why are we doing diligence? And ultimately, really the purpose of diligence is to understand, compartmentalize, and evaluate risk. It's because ultimately we're making a risk benefits investment. We're looking at a certain amount of risk, we're expecting a certain benefit, and we're evaluating those risks. And the goal with it is not to eliminate risk, but obviously understand which risks are shared, which ones can be managed, which ones can move forward. When you look at most companies, especially where we're investing and a lot of our colleagues are investing in, most are heavily dependent on human resources. Their human capital tends to be the largest single line on your expense line. There's a few that are separated, but if you kind of look at it generally, HR costs, or human capital costs are the most expensive. So that's a significant area you've got to look at. The other reason is you got to look at that is obviously a lot of times your existing operation dependent on human capital, but more importantly, your growth is. And that's where oftentimes we see potential issues. So we want to understand sort of, are there misidentified staff, misclassified staff that are not compliant? Because if you lose someone or you have a problem, not only do you have the penalties, but we're concerned also it could negatively impact the growth assumptions. And obviously, you invest assuming a certain level of growth. You want to see if you can accelerate their growth. So we look and have continued to spend even more time in the area of understanding, is there misclassification that we can address at the front end?
Thank you very much, Mike. And so over to you, from the perspective of an advisor on kind of both the operational structure and the HR infrastructure that's going to be used by clients in any given jurisdictions. During the discovery discussions with your clients, what are some of the key components that you always tend to dig into to make sure that you're avoiding any future headaches?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think it's really important for a lot of us to recognize that these deals have a lot of urgency to them in a lot of cases. And I think we do recognize, as Mike mentioned, there's a lot of upside, there's a lot of growth potential as a result. And so I think oftentimes the focal point becomes more on additional revenue, new opportunities, these types of focal areas that oftentimes fall more in the finance area. And we overlook, I think, a lot of times the softer space around the human capital elements here, the people elements. So a lot of times what we'll recommend doing, of course, is to make sure we are doing that thorough diligence and doing a bit of a almost limited audit, if you will, look through some of the contracts, look through some of the right to work requirements from some of the employees, round out the picture. Do you have contractors versus employees? Are they local? Are they expats? Touch on all different areas, as well as understanding just some elements perhaps that aren't contractual that you might still be on the hook for, let's say post integration. I think all of these are really important. In addition, because of the timing issue, looking at it structurally, Mark, as you kind of mentioned, how many employees are we going to be talking about? What are the roles? What are the activities in the country? Do we have different options available to us from a structural standpoint, to not have to always set up an entity? Maybe you can use other methodologies such as a PEO, such as a payroll, whatever it might be, but understanding what your requirements might be structurally is going to be helpful. And I think you have to understand more about the employee population to be able to do that.
Excellent, thank you very much. And so we mentioned in that last anecdote that there was a potential liability associated with misclassified contractor risk of $750,000 plus the option of future of potential fines and loss of revenue from clients that would require kind of regularized employees to service their accounts. Do you ever go into as much depth as calculating potential liability with regards to employees that you are inheriting as part of an acquisition, Mike? Is that something that you do as a matter of course, try to kind of calculate the potential risk of inheriting employee populations?
You do. I mean, it's not always a perfect science, and you've got to sometimes apply. But when you have certain key employees, especially ones that have significant involvement in customers or been with the company for a long time, it's important to understand is there any risk around those. The other one is if you're considering, and this comes up oftentimes when you're doing investments that may involve combinations, the synergy, efficiency, or reduction in force often are a significant part of the underwriting. So we'll spend significant time looking there at, is there sort of any unknown risks that could impact our assumptions on certain efficiency gains due to perhaps combining two companies together.
And follow-up question to that, if during the diligence process, either through diligence that you've worked on yourself or potentially through diligence that a partner like Vistra and Saul's team have kind of helped you identify, if you can kind of substantiate potential liability, for example, such as the one identified in that anecdote of $750,000 in potential liabilities with regards to those contractors, is that something you could take to the negotiating table with a potential seller and kind of use as a bargaining chip to kind of optimize the deal?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's something you want to talk about early. Obviously, you don't want surprises earlier in the process, but having an open conversation, especially having input from experts saying this is why there's going to be liability, and the biggest one is quantifying it. I think the most difficult thing in a deal is to sort of have a risk that you cannot quantify. Those are difficult conversations, but being able to quantify it to say this is the potential risk. Here's sort of low end. Here's high end. And is there a point we can agree that the deal still makes sense? And we've had those. We've closed over those with understanding there's a combination of whether it's escrow, in one case was insurance opportunities, but putting those around it doesn't mean a deal ends, but there's an opportunity to understand it further.
And just following on from that point where one of the most difficult parts of assessing the risk or potential liabilities is kind of like how to get to a figure at the end of it, right? Especially if you've got incomplete data. So following on from that, how important is it during the diligence process to kind of keep an eye on kind of future plans for an asset? For example, the potential for restructuring or dissolving an employee population. How much of an effect can those future plans have on your costs associated with it?
Yeah, and I think Mike touched on this a little bit in terms of being able to at least do some sort of financial planning around what this might look like if you reshape the workforce. Realize you actually have two different workforces potentially, right, that you have to take into account. In some cases, if the employee population is relatively similar, you might have some some employees doing the same roles. For instance, there might be some redundancy. There are going to be some controls around what you actually can and cannot do, let's say upon transfer of employees, depending where you are. But I think it's really important to understand generally what your future strategy is as well in the market. So if you're acquiring an asset and there are, you mentioned very early on, Mark, with a number of one-off type employee scenarios around other areas of the world, and in your current strategic plans, you don't really have a reason to be in that country, or you don't have plans to be in that country, you might actually look at it a little bit differently, perhaps, than if you are absorbing the handful of employees or more into the existing population, right? It's important to know, for instance, because of course you're bringing employees across, there's some obligations there as well. Are you prepared to support that with some type of a structure as well going forward? And what are you going to be obligated to provide those employees from a cost standpoint, maybe benefits, maybe additional enriched packages to be able to retain those employees too. All of this, I think, really is factored into the broader scope of the deal and what it really is going to take to ensure that you have not just done your diligence, but that you're able to close the deal and it's actually a successful opportunity for you to benefit from as a company.
Unmute myself. No, thank you very much. I think that segues nicely into our next section, which is transferring an asset and starting to implement your ROI strategy. And as with the last section, we will start with an Christmassy anecdotes, this one themed around the ghost of Christmas presents. In this kind of situation, this example, the PE fund client here had again acquired a peripheral employee population in Singapore that was a kind of small tail to a larger cross-border asset. And they had intended to potentially revisit those peripheral jurisdictions and reduce them, given they were not central to the investment thesis. But unfortunately, in this instance, once they closed on the asset, the dust had settled on the transaction, and they had time to kind of revisit some of those peripheral jurisdictions, of which Singapore was one, and decided to reduce the Singapore employee population. They found out that due to a mass redundancy reporting requirement in Singapore, for their kind of size of organization, they were limited to terminating only less than 5 employees within any 6-month periods, which obviously slowed down their ability to execute their ROI strategy significantly, and heightened a lot of regulatory risk, because if you do trigger that redundancy reporting requirement, that allowed the government to potentially conduct an audit of your country to make sure that that reduction was in line with actual business priorities. And on the back of an envelope, essentially, they decided that severing all of those employees, risking that regulatory review, and kind of agreeing mutual severance packages with the employees was more expensive than ultimately staggering the reduction of that employee population over a period of 18 months. So back of the envelope, they had to contend with an extra 400K in salary costs, as well as obviously all of the headache of kind of maintaining that employee and trying to find things to do with that employee base, which was at that point largely redundant. So again, that probably could have been avoided, that pain point, had that PE fund kind of dug into a little more what was possible from a regulatory point of view in that market. But obviously, we've got to be kind of conscious of the fact that it is very difficult sometimes to kind of guess or have a good handle on what your future plans are for any given asset, especially when it's a fast-moving deal and you're dealing with those peripheral markets that aren't necessarily central to your thinking. So going back to the kind of integration piece, what are, in your view, the most important consideration when it comes to closing on and transferring assets, of which human capital, as you mentioned, Mike, is obviously one of the most important aspects? Mike, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So, and it's a really good point. And you're right. There's always a speed of the deal, and there's to push to get it done. I think one of the key things is the discipline of understanding clearly what is the investment thesis and what's the justification. Because that investment thesis is based on generally going to be based either and or on growth, which is either through buying it, acquisitions, or sort of organic, or it's going to be based on synergy or efficiency improvements. There's going to be some type of assumptions. Most of the time, those are always dependent on human capital. So we do, and we've had experiences of, where we've had some where we've had independent contractor misclassified. We had one in Canada. We've had those issues, or you've closed with the assumption you're going to make certain expansions ex-US, and understanding the full cost of those and the time. But I really understanding how the human capital of the business day and in the future are tied, and what dependency exists between that and your assumptions for sort of in your underwriting for growth.
Very, very interesting. So tying the kind of ROI strategy very closely to what the employees are going to be doing, and then setting them up for success, essentially.
Right. So for example, if your growth, if the investment thesis says we're going to grow, and part of it is growing your sales staff, and that's maybe a field-based one, spending the time to understand what the structure and classification of the current sales staff versus what you're going to have to add in the future is critically important. If you get a sales staff of 10, 20, they're all independent contractors, and you start to really look at those and the controls over them, that starts to become areas where investing in that risk. Is there misclassification risk? And again, you don't look at every employee, but you can look at those groups that are highly dependent, that you're depending on to drive your investment thesis, and testing, are they meeting the requirements? And whether it's in say California or other states, is there risks around that classification? And I think one of the biggest issues, I think oftentimes, that it's not just a financial issue to the company. And I think that's where sometimes, just because I've had that experience, is it can be a disruptive event to the employee. An employee who's been a 10 or 15-year independent contractor and has kind of operated that way, and suddenly you're going to make a change and say, well, now they're an employee. It can be very disruptive to their life. They may have deductions running through there. They may be doing certain things, and switching them from that status over while you achieve compliance, you could actually lose that employee. And we've actually seen a case of that in a transaction.
Absolutely. And I'm definitely going to come back to the employee communications and some of the kind of softer aspects of transactions, because I think that's a very, very important point to revisit. But before we do so, Saul, you've obviously seen a lot of transitions, and I'd be interested in kind of what your kind of process is for ensuring an orderly transition of an asset, particularly from the regulatory point of view, knowing that you guys contend with a lot of things like the Acquired Rights Directive in Europe and similar kind of regulatory issues.
Yeah, that's right. So I think it is important to really understand, again, by country. At some points you can say as Acquired Right Directive in Europe. You also have 2P in the UK. You mentioned earlier some Singapore challenges around if you have a large employee population. So I think it's important to break it down to a level of by country and understanding what obligations you have for that employee population. Lining up, I would say, the existing employee population, if you have that, as well as those to be transferred, because what you, of course, need to uphold is making sure that your employees are no worse off from a compensation or supplemental benefits, some deemed benefits as well, making sure they're no worse off as a result of that transfer. So that's the first and foremost about ensuring you're able to not violate the terms and conditions that you have for the contracts. But then you can look at it as according to what current level of benefits, let's say, for instance, you have for that employee population. You might find, because if you're coming to maybe a bigger population base, you might actually have a richer package. That could be a real positive for the employees. Again, you mentioned, Mark, communication. That's a great communication point to actually get buy-in from the employees too. So there's a bit of a statutory requirements standpoint and a right to notify and consult with the employees, as well as making sure that they're no worse off from a terms and conditions standpoint. Again, understanding your requirements and your options by country is going to be really, really important as you start to look at moving these employees across.
Absolutely. And diving straight into that employee communications plan, how do you, as a third-party HR provider, essentially, which is part of Vistra's business, kind of develop and structure an employee communications plan? You mentioned highlighting the net benefits of an outsourced provider, but what are some of the considerations that you kind of that you take into account when trying to ensure that employees are happy and squared away and ready to generate value for their investment partner?
Yeah, it's very challenging, as I mentioned earlier, with the timing that you have in front of you. You have to get it right. I mean, this is, as a new employee, let's say, in the organization being transferred, you more or less get one opportunity to get it right, to get the proper level of compensation in place, transfer letters in place, communicate up front with the employees about the company, their role in the company, the culture of the company, bringing them into the discussion, again, above and beyond just the right to notify, right, and consult. Those are items you have to do. But above and beyond that, really bringing them in and managing the communication process, again, for the transferring employees, but also for the employees that may be feeling a little uncertain as well on the existing footprint, if there is one. You have to actually do it, and the messages are different for both, but it is really important to understand that both employees populations could be a little unsettled. Silence is nobody's friend in these cases. I think you need to make sure that you are being thorough in your communication and communicating more than less, let's say, to ensure that, again, that critical IP in the employees is being transferred across. Mike has already said this is priced into the deal. You certainly don't want to lose those heads on that because you stubbed your toe with communication, or it's taking longer to get benefits or structure put in place for these employees. So it's really important to get all of those elements lined up.
Yeah, that resonates massively with what we do at Velocity Global as well. We recognize and head off, straight on basically the fact that we're an outsourced third-party employer of records. A transition in a transaction is going to be an uncertain time for any employee, whether or not there's a third party involved. And if you then throw in that third party, that just adds to the kind of uncertainty and complexity of a transition in employment. So we dedicate a lot of time and like to bank at least 2 weeks, if possible, given transaction timelines, for the execution of an employee communications plan, which that the end employer of the employees in question. And we try to focus exactly on what you said earlier, Saul, which is using an outsourced HR provider. Typically, certainly for smaller employee populations, the HR support in the sense of actual on-the-ground HR specialists in the time zone with fluency in the local language and access to local benefits, etc., is going to be greater than what an employer would potentially be able to directly provide. Certainly those smaller employee populations in the terms of kind of tailored benefits, etc. Because obviously setting up a high-spec benefits package for 2 employees is a lot trickier and costlier than doing so for larger employee population. Mike, very interested in your perspective here. When obviously when you're investing in an investment partner, you'll have some kind of influence in terms of what the future development is, or in certain cases at least, have some kind of influence in terms of what the future state of that asset is. Do you get involved at all with regards to the employee communications, or how do you feature, and how do your kind of like hopes for your investment asset feature in the employee communications?
Well, it's a good question. And we always want to have some involvement in communication. Obviously, there is a seller, and we never want to be heavy-handed. We respect our sellers. Most of our investments are with founder-led businesses, so we want to be respectful of this. The team is going to continue to lead the business going forward. But I think where we can help is, in many cases, companies have never gone through these types of transitions. So by bringing in additional resources or helping them understand where there are risks or where there's potential pitfalls, where communication can avoid that, you know, especially, you know, how do you handle sort of the question of what's going to happen? Sometimes you don't always have the answers, but there's ways to answer those questions, you know, Saul mentioned, in a way that doesn't create additional anxiety, because you don't want an anxious workforce. You don't want a workforce that's spending their time thinking about what happens to me. Because I mean, obviously it's, you know, they're higher trainees, right? They're going to think first what happens to them, and they're not going to be thinking of how to take care of our customers. So we do want to get involved in that. It's some you're more involved than others, but if the deal and the relationship is the right, and I think that's where, you know, you spend time developing that, there is an opportunity to work together to achieve a good outcome for those employees, whether that is sometimes a difficult decision of, you know, reducing, or the opportunity to add additional employees or make changes to current staff. Having that conversation earlier in the deal structure is much better, obviously, than waiting till the last minute. And you don't want to have it right after closing.
No. Exactly. No, I agree. And that's why I mentioned that we try to bank on at least 2 weeks, just to allow the employees, the individuals, these are people at the end of the day, just to absorb what they're being offered, what the status is, ask questions, and really become comfortable with the setup. It's very important to kind of think of them as individuals rather than figures on a balance sheet, right? Mike, we recently worked on a project for an investment company of yours, for which you know, part of the growth strategy was expanding into new markets. In terms of kind of those ROI strategies and you know, kind of growing an investment company, how important and how often, how prevalent is kind of international growth in that strategy?
It's and actually it's becoming more. It's, you know, you kind of think about even over the last 5-10 years, the market has continued to become more and more global. And what, you know, maybe 15-20 years ago, a mid-size or mid-cap company may have never thought of selling overseas. Today, many of those companies have not only current sales, but also additional opportunities. And the one you and I worked on, this company had some international sales that we're seeing growth in it. It was primarily through distributors, which, you know, we're product agnostic. They don't, you know, your products are, you know, your products are not given any advantage. And one of the opportunities was to look to say, can we become closer to the customer in those countries that we saw growth? And, you know, if you kind of look at the growth curve globally, much of, especially in the healthcare and fields like that, the demand growth really is more ex-US than it is in the US. So there was an opportunity here to, you know, look at a way to accelerate that growth using a POA.
Yeah. So, I mean, I imagine that you're seeing a lot of kind of similar trends. So companies that are looking to kind of, you know, test new markets, grow their business in new markets in a kind of asset-light way. So using international PO or other outsourced corporate functions that Vistra provides. Just interested in hearing your perspective, on kind of any trends around that, but also more generally, when you are helping a PE or strategic buyer with finding international operational efficiencies rather for outsourced kind of functions that Vistra supports with. Are there any trends? Are there any particular kind of areas that you think companies should consider in the context of kind of reducing their operational expenditure after acquiring an asset?
Yeah, and I think we've really hit on a lot of these more recently in the last 9 months, even more than what we might recommend in a lot of cases. What we see through a lot of M&A activity is some PE firms, let's say, go on a bit of a shopping spree, buy a number of businesses in the same space, do a consolidation or roll up, and then you find yourself with maybe multiple entities. Let's say in the UK you have 2 or 3 different entities, populations maybe of each with employees. So looking at that as more of a combination effort, and then deregistering, let's say, some of those duplicative entities, we would call it entity rationalization. We're doing interesting. We do that just quite a bit in general. I think now, though, we're being forced to actually look at this because of the current environment and the pandemic. It's focused a lot of buyers and CFOs on looking at where do we have redundancies, or where we had some struggles delivering during this time frame. maybe we could look at changing our supply chain a little bit to either more inexpensive jurisdictions or places really that were maybe a little less impacted, for instance. But the actual viewpoint is the same, where you're looking to refine, reduce redundancies. I oftentimes will say this, whether it's expansion or reduction, you do need to look, even if you're going into a new country, not only the cost of going in, but also the cost of coming back out if your strategy doesn't work, because that doesn't go away. Otherwise, you find yourself with, again, extra compliance, extra risk if you're being non-compliant, let's say, and then cost to exit the country as well. So I think some of the same things have just kind of maybe bubbled up a little bit more within our clients, and they're really focused on cost efficiencies, entity reductions or rationalizations, and future-proofing themselves as we hopefully will come out of this on the other side and start a period of even more exponential growth.
Yeah. And this is something that the strategic partnerships team at Velocity Global does a lot of, and I'm sure Vistra does too. But to what extent can you model out different options from a kind of cost perspective for clients that are considering rationalizing it? So can you kind of war game different options and kind of come out with a preferred option after considering the costs and liabilities of each?
Yeah, I think you can. I think you have to look at generally, again, at a country level, what is the cost to enter, both from, say, setting up a new entity, for instance, standpoint, and then, what are the costs for the employees? So what's the Social Security rates? What's the employer portion of taxes? Is there a pension or not? Is it a standard item, let's say, to have supplemental benefits? A lot of employees will tell you company car is standard here in this country. Not always the case, of course, and so you have to pressure test some of these, but all these are real costs potentially, of being in some of the countries, and you can compare and contrast versus a variety of different countries in Europe, let's say, or regionally, again, in Asia, you could do the same thing, and just kind of mapping out your corporate tax rates too, or the withholding taxes. You kind of build a story as you go, both on a corporate compliance and an employee standpoint, and get a good viewpoint in terms of what makes the most sense for us as a business. And then frankly, what I always layer in is the commercials. Is the commercial there to back this up? Where are we headed? I think that's really important to overlay that within the proposed countries of consideration.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Mike.
I just one thing I think Saul has really hit a good point. It's the ongoing cost, and one of those costs oftentimes is really overlooked. It's easy for managers to say, okay, it's going to cost us to set up an entity in another country, and we'll set it, and we can figure the pay tax. It's the internal management cost of the ongoing keeping track of what changes we're in, what we have to manage, and suddenly, you can see, suddenly there's 2 more FTEs in the finance department to manage that. That hidden cost is also oftentimes unanticipated. That it's what is going to impact to the current infrastructure to manage 4 people in 4 different countries. Even though strategically those 4 people are really critical, they've driven sales, the internal management cost of that, it can be significant.
It's very difficult to find a single HR person that's versed in Maltese and South African law.
Absolutely.
So no, I completely agree with you. That's kind of the sweet spot for us and our clients as well. It's when there are those dispersed employee population that imply a regulatory complexity individual to each market. Finding a partner that can combine that resource in one spot is very often going to be a cost saving. All right, so moving into kind of the future of a business. Again, as with last time, I'll start with an anecdote. Future-proofing an asset. In this anecdote, we were talking about a PE fund that acquired a carve-out asset that involved an employee population in the Netherlands. They had plenty of time to set up a Dutch company. The Dutch employees were transferred in that company. But part of their ROI strategy, or part of their strategy for Europe, actually, because the Netherlands were their HQ, the European HQ in that instance, was moving a US exec, which is where the parent was based, or the new parent was based, to the Netherlands to kind of run the show and run their kind of development strategy in Europe. Unfortunately, what they had not foreseen was that in the Netherlands, you need a special license to become a recognized sponsor of foreign employees. And it can take between 3 and 4 months to get that. And with COVID, everything government related was delayed, so it took even longer. And obviously that time gap, delayed their strategy a little bit. There was some ad hoc kind of traveling back and forth that was available, but it was a bit of a pain more than anything, essentially. So the anecdote here just shows that there is some, there are some kind of benefits to kind of thinking ahead in terms of what future needs, both from an HR operational and kind of more general standpoint, your asset will need as you implement the ROI strategy, but also how to maintain flexibility to make sure you can pivot accordingly. So with that in mind, Mike, maybe we'll start with you again. How far ahead do you think, when you've just acquired an asset or even in the diligence phase, are you thinking kind of 10 years ahead, or are you thinking ahead to kind of exit?
It's a good question. You never want to always plan on just saying how we're going to exit, but I think you have to, when you make investment, clearly understand the justification. And I know I've started with this at the beginning is, if you don't clearly understand sort of why is this investment make sense? What is it that is attractive? And more importantly, what will make this asset attractive, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, 9 years in the future, to a buyer? And part of that is really going to be, when we all think about it, it's growth. It's efficiency increases and growth. Otherwise, it's really the same company you started with. So growth today, you have to take into consideration, you're going to be adding human capital, and that human capital could be in the US, could be in other countries. You're going to be adding customers. Those customers are maybe in other countries, and moving out and managing them. The final piece is adding the human capital. In today's market, especially after 2020, that human capital may not always be located in an ideal location. They may be the best location, or they may decide they're living. And one of the things I could share with you earlier, we're looking at a very good employee who was joined, phenomenal leader, company works a lot virtually. He's looking to relocate to Colombia because that's where his fiance is, and they can't get a visa, so he wants to move back there. So suddenly you're looking and saying, well, I can't lose that piece of that human capital and value. How do we manage that back there? So I think more and more we continue to ask the question of sort of how does this human capital impact our assumptions around the value we're going to create in the future? Because if we ignore that piece, it doesn't really make sense. It's really, that's what's going to drive your growth, is that human capital.
That tally with what you're seeing, Saul, as well? Are your clients kind of most concerned when it comes to kind of future planning with what their flexibility is with regards to their employee population, or are there kind of other aspects of that future-proofing of kind of operational functions that you see as well?
Yeah, and I think we've had a lot more of these conversations recently, right over the last 9 months, as you went through phases of first helping clients solve for employees stuck in country on holiday or whatever it might have been, short-term assignment, and you kind of move past it, and you started to look at more, well, now we actually might, this has worked out pretty well, we actually might want to stay, now what? And I think where we would historically have looked at maybe a traditional, let's call it expat type of arrangement, where you maybe move a very senior level of staff to a country to bring your corporate culture to that country, help grow that region, really focus on some growth along those lines and improving ROIs. Now you're actually looking at it slightly differently. We have a lot more individual employees coming, requesting from you as an employer, I would like to work in X country, and what are you prepared to do to help support me? I think it's changing the narrative a little bit and forcing companies to think about the different levels of support that you will provide. Again, oftentimes I kind of come back to the commercials and say, is there a valid commercial reason to have someone there? I.e., is it a company beneficial, or is this beneficial to the employee? Because if it is a one-off employee, again, there are structural requirements, there are compliance requirements, there's cost requirements for these employees. And what are you willing to support as an employer? I think it's a good conversation to have. You want to preserve that IP of the employees, again, to help grow your ROI. But at some point, there is a bit of a decision point where you have to decide as a company, how far you're willing to take that.
Yeah. No, that definitely resonates with a lot of what we're seeing in the kind of COVID and enforced work from home or anywhere for that matter.
Yeah.
A lot of kind of clients, including big 5 tech companies, have come to us asking, to what extent international PO can be used to offer key employees as a benefit, the ability to work from anywhere compliantly, obviously, for either a defined period or indefinitely. And while that may be absolutely, an option given in situations where the employee in question is providing light services and their activities and presence in the market isn't creating permanent establishments, you're absolutely right that at a certain point there's an inflection point where you have to kind of think of these benefits in a more structured way. So how is this going to be part of our company handbook, our company policy? Let's make sure that we're offering benefits in a level way across all employees.
That's right.
But I certainly agree that the trend of kind of providing that flexible workplace is something that has increased exponentially over the last 12 months or 8 months, depending on when you count it from.
Where you are, yeah.
Mike, we've discussed this in the past, but you have a kind of a mapped out exit due diligence process that kind of makes sure that you're ticking all of the boxes to make sure that your asset is as attractive as it can be to any potential buyers when you're looking to transfer or to sell an asset. Be very interested in hearing your views on what some of those main kind of boxes to tick are, and what some of the biggest inhibitors for ROI, or some of the biggest bargaining points that may be used against you in negotiations, if there's any trend or theme around those.
No, it's a good question. Look, it's just like, I always try to keep someone think about it as you're going to sell your house. You go around and say, is there marks on the wall, or is there things that a buyer would cause concern? And I think about it oftentimes in the same way. That part of the wall that you've always seen, those few little marks, to you, that's where somebody ran into it. But to a buyer, they look and say, well, maybe that's mold, or maybe that's something leaking. And for you, it's a small little fix, but for that buyer, they're suddenly in their mind thinking it's a big fix. Yeah. And so we're, thinking about it the same way. When you think about an asset that's attracting attention, and there's going to be an exit at some point, you want that asset not to have anything that caused a buyer to have concerns, or something that creates an opportunity for a buyer to say, well, maybe the price shouldn't be, or maybe there's a buyer that says, well, if I've got to fix that, then probably I don't want to do it. I want a turnkey. I don't want to have to do a fix up or repair something. So we've, become much more focused on looking for those carriers. Now, obviously, any buyer will look at different things, but all of us who've been buyers kind of, where the risks are. It's in human capital, it's in information security, it's around environmental. It's pretty easy to go through those lists and say, is there problems here that we may have to address? And if there are, do we address them, or do we have that conversation early on so that we've quantified it, understand what it is, and it can be factored in?
Yeah, that resonates hugely with us, because we have seen quite a few projects now, mostly with VC-backed companies prior to a funding event or a sale, where the VC or the tech company in most cases come to us with concerns of the would-be investor, would-be buyer around the use of independent contractors, for example, a number of different levels. Yeah. The first level is the fact that there's obviously regulatory issues, which we discussed, in the potential fines for misused independent contractors. But beyond that, there's significant IP risk that is uncovered. So if that misclassified contractor has access to mission critical source code, and they're based in a jurisdiction which might not be as friendly to the US as others, Russia or China, for example, there's very little stopping that employee from going off and starting a rival company with that same source code. Good luck to the US-based tech company in trying to enforce a misclassified independent contractor vis-a-vis a Russian or Chinese national as a US LLC. There's little or no chance of that being a profitable endeavor. And beyond that, then there's all the accounting risk as well. So what we see a lot of is, as diligence is undertaken by these future funding partners, of going through the books of that asset. They identify all of these outgoing costs or these pots of money flying from the corporate bank account in the US to individual private bank accounts in Russia, India, China, and that can raise a few eyebrows. So we're often brought in to kind of regularize those employees very quickly, via an onshore services agreement in the US, and we then take care of supporting the employees. And that just kind of really minimizes that risk and that kind of worry factor with regards to the would-be funding kind of an investor. Is that something that you see as well, Saul? I mean, when you are kind of advising a client on the transfer of assets, I know you do that from the side. Do you do that to a certain extent from the sell side as well?
Yeah, I think we see it from existing client base, frankly. As you start to get some of the questions around, oh, are we compliant in all of the countries, even though, we're tasked with ensuring that is the case. They want to have all of the details, right? They want to be able to share all of their compliance filings, all of their contracts, get all of their pieces of employee data, let's call it, back, so that they have them able to be shared right through their own diligence process. And I think like you say, it's all about non-compliance and the risk that comes with it, as well as potential liabilities. Again, thinking on the other side, the diligence that has to be done, and the model that has to be built around these potential liabilities, I think is really kind of where we come in and how we can help our clients to gather those elements and demonstrate really that you're not non-compliant effectively.
All right, thank you very much, Phil. We're coming up on the hour on time here, so I want to give an opportunity to anybody on the call to ask some questions. Feel free to either type it in the chat or unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and give us a whirl. We'd be happy to try and answer most of these. If not, I've got plenty more questions, but I'm sure you're all tired of hearing my voice. Okay, maybe I'll start one to kick it off. So one of the big things that 2020 has taught us is that there is no such thing as no uncertainty. There's always a curveball that life or a virus can throw at us and the economy at large. So what I've certainly been seeing on the Velocity Global side is a huge kind of trend toward asset-light acquisitions. Kind of ways in which you can minimize the capital expenditure for assets by kind of focusing on kind of lighter investment models that are easier to kind of change and pivot with as well, particularly kind of human capital focused transactions. Is that something you're seeing as well, Mike, and interesting in kind of what your or XLR partners kind of strategy is going into 2021? Are there any lessons learned in 2020, and are there any kind of focus points for the next year that you think you'd like to share?
Well, it's I think the story or sort of the lessons of 2020 are still being learned, and I think it's we're going to look back 2-3 years and start to realize, oh, there were trends there. It's like kind of you're living in history. You won't know it until you get to look back. But I think there's some key things we are definitely seeing, macro changes, and one of which is I think there is a disruptive event to the sort of employer-employee relationship, and what I mean by that is that the opportunity to have more flexibility in where someone lives and works has locked in. I mean, if this had lasted 2, 3, 4 months, but we're going to be a year. And I think the dynamic between sort of employees have changed. And we're thinking about that is that how do we stay competitive? Because ultimately you're looking for talent, you're competing for talent. And so if our investments, our companies are not competitive, if they cannot offer the same opportunities as other companies, then we're not going to be able to compete for that key talent, which means we may not be able to drive the highest from our investment, because we're just not as competitive on the human capital side. I think that's probably one of the key lessons we've started to see.
Does that resonate with what you're seeing as well, Saul? What you're hearing from your kind of PE partners in the line?
Yeah, I think just to tail in on that, we are seeing the same. I think there is a really important point about how do you retain that talent that you have. And I think what we've seen a lot of our clients being focused on is are we putting together a total reward strategy that is effective in reducing churn, retaining employees? And again, it goes above and beyond just salary compensation. What about benefits? We're seeing employee well-being being a real focus for employers, and there's a lot of people struggling through this time, and I think if you can enrich some of these packages and show that commitment as an employer, I think you can have a chance of retaining some of that talent, whether it's employee assistance programs, some additional supplemental help you can get your employees, as well as you go through this downturn. I think it's important, and again, I think it forces us as well to understand how willing are we as an employer to support this mobile workforce that might come to you seeking these reassignments now. Again, maybe a decision you want to entertain from a commercial reason, or because it's a really important employee you want to keep. So I think it's a good discussion to have and be armed to have, frankly.
Yeah, and just looking at that same perspective from the opposite lens, I've had a lot of events and discussions from PE funds and other people around an acqui-hire trend, whereby kind of a larger corporation will identify a function within another company, usually an R&D function or a certain kind of specific team that is very adept and very good, which are rising up and kind of coming to the fore in this kind of outsourced mobile remote workforce, and kind of targeting that particular team in a carve-out situation. This acqui-hire term that's been coming up. So potentially, it's going to be very, very important, certainly for companies and investment companies, to kind of protect their core human resources through kind of this total reward strategy, and potentially also avoid an acqui-hire in that sense as well. So good. So I think we've got about a minute left. We haven't had any more questions from the audience, so I think we'll leave it at that. But thank you very, very much for your time, Mike and Saul. It's been super interesting. I hope everyone enjoyed it and appreciated the kind of minor festive spirit that we brought to an otherwise gloomy 2020. And here's to 2021 being very successful in the M&A world and in the mid-market M&A world. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mike and Sol. A very interesting talk, and I'm pretty sure everybody learned a lot. Hope to see everybody finish this year strong. Good luck with ending 2020 and starting fresh in 2021. And we'll see everyone soon at a different event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne.